The marketplace stank of sweat, smoke, and despair. It wasn't the kind of place where people came to barter for grain or fabrics. This square was reserved for the sale of lives. Here, beneath the rough wooden platform raised on 4 cracked beams, men and women were paraded like livestock. Voices rang out, coarse shouts, mocking laughter, the sing-song cry of the auctioneer calling for bids. But on that day, something happened so grotesque, so inhuman, that even the hard-eyed crowd stirred with unease. A woman had died giving birth in the early morning. Her body was still cooling in the corner of the hut where she fell, and already the newborn child was brought to the block. The villagers believed the baby cursed, a bad omen. To them, she was nothing but an unwanted burden, another mouth to feed when hunger gnawed at every household. So they bundled her in a piece of blood-stained cloth and dragged her, barely hours old, to the auction stage. The child was whimpering, not yet strong enough for a full cry. Her tiny limbs trembled, her skin still mottled red with the strain of birth. The auctioneer held her aloft like some grotesque trophy, his voice booming over the restless crowd. Here now, a newborn. Strong lungs if she survives. Bid for her. She can serve or be molded as you like. Who'll start at 2 silver? The crowd shuffled, murmured. A few men barked cruel jokes. Some women turned away. To buy a newborn was strange even in this place where human life was always for sale. Too fragile, too uncertain. Not worth the coin. And yet, among the throng, one man did not jeer, nor did he avert his gaze. He was a traveler, his cloak dusty from long roads, his satchel worn from use. He had come to the market for supplies, not slaves. His eyes, dark with fatigue, fixed on the child. She was not an investment, not a tool. She was simply a life that should not begin in chains. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the price. 1 silver, then. Who'll take her for 1? Still no hands lifted. The crowd laughed. One man spat on the ground and muttered, not worth a loaf of bread. The traveler's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, his voice clear but steady. 2 silver. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. 2 silver? A fair bid. Do I hear 3? He scanned the crowd, but no one bothered to raise the price. Why compete for something they saw as useless? The gavel struck wood with a dull thud. Sold to the stranger. The laughter rolled again, this time mocking the traveler. Fool, someone shouted. He's bought himself a mouth to feed. The man ignored them. He climbed the steps to the platform and took the child into his arms. She was so small, so impossibly fragile, her breath a faint whisper against his chest. The blood-stained cloth dampened his sleeve, a grim reminder of the mother who had given her life to bring this child into the world. The auctioneer smirked as he pocketed the coins. You'll regret that purchase, traveler. There's no profit in her. The man's reply was quiet, but it carried. I didn't buy her for profit. I bought her for freedom. For a moment, the jeering softened. The crowd didn't understand him. Perhaps they thought him mad or soft-hearted. But as he descended from the platform, no one stopped him. The baby stirred, her tiny fist curling against the coarse fabric of his cloak. He adjusted her gently, cradling her closer to his chest. She did not know she had been sold, nor that her life had already been dismissed by those around her. She knew only the warmth of a heartbeat, the steadiness of arms that held her not as property but as something fragile and precious. The road out of the market stretched long and dusty before him. He had no plan, no certainty of how he would care for her, but the choice had been made. He would not let her first breath be chained to ownership. He would give her something no one else in that marketplace had thought she deserved, the chance to live free. Behind him, the auctioneer's voice rang out again, selling off another body. The crowd roared, coins clinked, the machinery of cruelty continued. But for one child, still bleeding from the moment of her birth, the cycle had been broken. In his arms, she gave the faintest sigh as though in relief. The traveler whispered. Into the top of her head, words meant only for her. You are not mine. You belong to no one. Remember this, little one. Your life is your own. And with that, he walked away from the auction block, carrying not a purchase, but a promise. Night fell heavy over the road. The traveler had carried the newborn out of the marketplace, away from the smoke and jeering voices, toward the wilderness where the air was sharp with pine and silence stretched like an open field. But silence was not peace, not for the child. Her cries had grown faint, shallow, not the strong wails of a healthy infant, but the fragile whimper of one too weak to protest her own suffering. The cloth that wrapped her was stiff with blood, some her mother's, some her own. Her skin was pale now, lips quivering as if she were hovering between worlds. The traveler found a hollow beneath an old tree where the wind could not pierce. He knelt and placed the bundle on his lap, unwrapping the soiled cloth. His hands were steady, though inside him rose an unfamiliar fear. He had seen men die on battlefields, had watched sickness sweep through towns, but never had he held life so fresh, so breakable, on the edge of slipping away. The baby gave a thin sound, not quite a cry, more like the echo of one. It was pitiful, haunting, the sound of a being who had not yet learned the language of survival. The traveler's throat tightened. He spoke softly, though he knew she could not understand. Cry, little one. Don't hold back. The world needs to hear you're alive. But she only trembled, eyelids fluttering. Her breaths were shallow wisps. Against the cool air, he searched his satchel. Hard bread, dried meat, a flask of water. Nothing for a child. His heart sank. He knew the village midwives would not help. They had already condemned her as cursed. To them, she was less than nothing. But to him, she was the only thing that mattered. He dipped a strip of cloth in water and touched it to her lips. For a moment, there was no response. Then, instinct stirring, she suckled weakly at the damp fiber. Relief swept through him like warmth after frost. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The traveler leaned back against the tree trunk, holding her against his chest for warmth. The stars spread above them, cold fires burning in the vast dark. He remembered the look on the auctioneer's face, the mockery in the crowd. They saw only a burden. But in his arms she was a testament, a fragile, breathing defiance against cruelty. Through the night, he kept vigil. Every faint whimper pierced him. Every shallow breath set his heart racing. He found himself praying, though he was not a praying man. Let her live. If there is any justice, let her live. At dawn, when the first light spilled over the horizon, the child stirred with a sound just a little stronger than before. Not yet a full cry, but enough to rouse hope. He smiled wearily, brushing a fingertip over her tiny hand. She grasped at him reflexively, the way all newborns do, her strength no bigger than a whisper, but it was strength nonetheless. The traveler exhaled, slow and deliberate. He had not realized until then how tightly he had been holding his own breath. He whispered to her again, voice low and steady. You have a right to be here. Do you hear me? A right. They tried to sell you as though you were less than human. But you are not theirs. You are not mine, either. You belong to yourself, little one, always. Her hand remained curled around his finger. Her silent cry was slowly giving way to a fragile, persistent breath. And though she did not yet understand, her tiny grip felt like a promise returned. He knew then that saving her would not be a moment's act but a lifetime's burden. She would need food, shelter, protection. She would face scorn from those who believed her cursed. Perhaps he had invited hardship upon himself by stepping forward at that auction. And yet, as he rose with the infant nestled to his chest, he felt no regret. The coins he had spent were gone, but in their place was something far greater, the chance for this small, stubborn life to grow. The road stretched ahead, winding into mountains. He began walking, steady and sure, whispering to her as if each word were a shield against the harshness of the world. "You are not alone, not anymore." The child gave a faint sound again, this time sharper, fuller. Not yet a wail, but close. The traveler smiled through his exhaustion. The silent cry was ending. The world would soon hear her voice. The village they left behind was not unique. All across the region, the same customs held sway. The weak were cast aside, the unwanted sold, the helpless bound in chains of tradition that claimed to be older than memory itself. The traveler had seen these chains before, not iron shackles, but laws unspoken and unquestioned. Rules that said a child without a family must belong to someone, that life itself was measured in coin, that the poor must sell what little they had, even blood, even kin. It was these chains, not just the auction block, that he carried the child away from. The road led him to another settlement a few days' journey away, a town larger than the one that had scorned her. Its walls were higher, its markets wider, but the smell was the same: fear, hunger, resignation. He entered, with the infant cradled against his chest, wrapped now in a cleaner cloth torn from his own cloak. She was stronger than when he first took her, her cries now soft but steady, proof that life clung stubbornly to her tiny body. As he walked through the market square, eyes turned toward him. Whispers followed. Mothers carrying baskets pulled their children closer. Old men shook their heads. One bold voice muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Why carry a cursed one through here? She won't live the season." The traveler ignored them, but inside his jaw clenched. This was the chain, not steel, but belief. A belief that some lives were doomed from the start, that mercy was wasted where profit could not be made. Avitia. Well, he asked a woman drawing water if there was a healer nearby. She glanced at the bundle in his arms, and her face hardened. "No healer will touch that. Best leave her to the earth. It's kinder." Her words struck like a knife, not because they were cruel, but because she spoke them as if they were common sense. Custom had hollowed out compassion until it was nothing but ash. The traveler thanked her anyway and moved on. He knew then that no healer here would help, no midwife would lend guidance. He would have to rely on his own hands, his own stubborn will. That night, he found shelter beneath a wooden awning near the edge of the town. He fed the baby drops of warm water mixed with softened bread, crude but enough to ease her hunger. She slept curled against his chest, her breath finally steady, while the murmur of the town drifted through the dark. He overheard their voices, the market men, the gossiping wives. They say he paid coin for her. Madness. Worse than madness. Defiance. Who was he to stand against custom? There it was again. The chain tightening, not around his wrists, but around their minds. He understood the danger. To defy one market was nothing, but to challenge the law of many? That was a weight heavier than any sword he had carried. Still, as he watched the baby's chest rise and fall, he knew he could not return her, could not bend to the customs that would see her discarded. She had been born into chains, but he would not let her grow in them. The next morning, when he set out from the town, a small group gathered at the gate, not to stop him, but to watch. Their stares were sharp, their whispers cutting. One man called after him, "Stranger, don't think your defiance will change the world. This is how it has always been." The traveler paused, his cloak stirring in the wind. He did not turn, but his words carried back. Chains remain only because no one dares to break them. Then he walked on, the infant safe in his arms. Road stretched ahead again, uncertain, dangerous. Yet something had shifted. He had not merely bought her freedom. He had declared himself against the custom that bound her. And though the crowd saw him as a fool, perhaps even a threat, he carried with him the knowledge that change begins with one act, one refusal, one child saved from the block. A baby. Stirred, giving a soft cry that grew louder, more insistent. He smiled faintly at the sound. Her voice, once silent, was now rising, not just against the night, but against the chains of custom that had tried to claim her before she could even speak. Years passed like the turning of slow pages. The child who had once been a blood-stained bundle was no longer silent. She grew with a stubborn spark in her eyes, the kind of flame that refused to be snuffed out by whispers of curses or the weight of custom. The traveler, now her guardian in all but name, raised her with hands that had known the sword but now learned gentleness. He taught her how to walk on uneven ground, how to drink from streams, how to listen for the sound of danger before it arrived. But more than survival, he taught her something rare, the truth of her own worth. She called him nothing grand. Not father, not master. He never asked her to. To her, he was simply the man who carried her when she was too tired to walk, who stood between her and the world when it turned unkind, who reminded her each night as she fell asleep, "By the fire, you are not mine, you are your own." It puzzled her as she grew older. In the nearby villages, she saw how children bowed to fathers, how wives deferred to husbands, how servants lowered their eyes before masters. Ownership was everywhere, woven into daily life. Yet the man who had taken her from the auction spoke, always against it. Why? She asked him once, her voice still high and uncertain, "Why did you take me, if not to keep me?" They were camped beneath the ruins of an old stone bridge, the river below reflecting firelight. He paused, turning the question over in his mind, and finally answered, "Because no one else would." "And because your life was not theirs to sell." She frowned. "But you paid for me." He nodded slowly. "I paid not to own you, but to stop them from owning you. Do you understand?" She thought hard, little brows knitting together. "So, I was free, even then?" He smiled, faint but proud. "Yes, you just didn't know it yet." The lesson lodged in her heart. As she grew, she carried it like a secret stone, heavy at times, but unbreakable. The world around them did not understand. Travelers who crossed their path sometimes mistook her for a servant, or worse, a prize he had claimed. When she grew older, with hair long and wild, with eyes too fierce for her age, the assumptions grew sharper. Strangers whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, but whenever she turned to him in confusion or shame, his answer was always the same: "Let them whisper. They do not decide who you are. Only you can do that." The bond between them was not one of blood, nor of transaction, but of trust. And yet, as she grew into her own strength, she began to feel the weight of his choice, the day he had stepped forward at the auction. One evening, older now and bold enough to demand answers, she asked, "Why risk yourself? You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." The man was silent for a long time. His hands, scarred from battles long past, rested on the hilt of a blade he no longer carried for glory. His eyes were weary, but when he met hers, they were steady. "Because if I had walked away, then I would be no better than the ones who sold you, and have lived too long carrying regrets. I would not carry that one." Her chest tightened at his words. She understood then that his act had not only freed her, it had redeemed something in him. From that day forward, she carried herself differently. Not as someone saved, but as someone entrusted with a gift, her own life given back to her when it could have been stolen. She began to see her freedom not as charity, but as responsibility. To live boldly, to prove the jeers and the customs wrong, to stand tall where others had bent their heads. The world still called her many things, cursed, worthless, strange. But when she lay down at night, the firelight dancing on the man's worn face, she repeated his words in her own heart. Bought, but not owned. Saved, but not shackled. My life is mine, Dot, and with each sunrise she grew stronger in that truth. Among the few possessions the traveler carried, none was more carefully guarded than a strip of rough cloth, brown with age. Stiff in places where the stains of dried blood had never truly faded. Dot, it was the cloth she had been wrapped in on. The day of her birth, the day her mother's life ended and her own was nearly sold away. The day he had stepped forward with silver in his hand and defiance in his heart. He had never told her why he kept it. For years it remained folded in the bottom of his satchel, untouched but never discarded. She sometimes glimpsed it when he packed or unpacked by the fire, but she did not ask Dot until one night. They had been traveling through a valley where the air was damp and heavy with mist. The child, now no longer a child but a girl on the edge of womanhood, sat near the fire, brushing twigs from her hair. She noticed the cloth again when he drew it out to shake dust from the bag. Her curiosity, long restrained, finally spilled. Over, why do you keep that? She asked Dot. The traveler stilled. For a moment, he seemed caught between hiding it again and offering it to her. At last, he handed it over. She held it gingerly. It was coarse against her fingers, still smelling. Faintly of iron, though so many seasons had passed. This, he said quietly, is where you began. She stared at it, her brows furrowing. It's filthy. I don't want to remember that. His eyes softened, though his voice carried weight. It's filthy, yes. But it is also the proof of what you survived. Some people carry scars on their skin. This cloth is your scar. She frowned, gripping the fabric more tightly. Why keep a scar? Because scars remind us that the wound is no longer open, he said. This cloth tells me that you lived, though the world tried to deny you that chance. His words lingered with her. She wrapped the cloth and unwrapped it again, torn, between revulsion and a strange, aching pride. It was the last trace of her mother, the only witness to the moment she had entered a world already prepared to sell her away. In the days that followed, she began to carry the cloth herself, at first tucked in the bottom of her own small pack. Later, braided into the strap of her satchel where it could be seen. Strangers noticed it sometimes, some wrinkled their noses, some muttered about omens. But she kept it close all the same. One day, as they stopped in a bustling town, a merchant scoffed openly. Girl, why wear rags like that? It marks you. As cursed, you'd do better to burn it. She lifted her chin, her voice steady though her cheeks burned. It marks me as alive. That is more than you can say for those who mocked me when I was born. The traveler, watching from nearby, did not intervene. He saw the steel in her gaze and knew she had claimed the meaning of the cloth for herself. From then on, the blood-stained strip was not a shameful relic, but a banner of survival. It was the proof that she had been unwanted, discarded, sold, and yet had lived. The mark of blood no longer spoke of death, but of defiance. Still, there were nights when she held it close and wondered what her mother had been like. She had no memory, only this fragment. The man who raised her could tell her little. He had not known her mother, only the cruel fate that had befallen them both. So the cloth became her link, not just to her survival, but to the woman who had given her life. A reminder that she was born in blood and loss, but carried forward in freedom and resilience. The traveler noticed the change. One evening, as they sat beneath a starlit sky, he nodded toward the cloth where it hung at her side. You've made it yours now, he said. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the frayed edge. No, It was always mine. I just had to see it that way. And in that moment, he realized something. He no longer needed to guard her story for her. She had taken it into her own hands, shaped it into strength instead of shame. The mark of blood was not her curse. It was her crown. The years of traveling had hardened her steps and sharpened her gaze, but they had not softened the whispers. Wherever they went, townsfolk still looked askance, still muttered behind their hands, still judged the girl who carried a strip of blood-stained cloth at her side. But in one town, the whispers grew into something sharper. It was market day, and the square was swollen with noise, the clatter of carts, the scent of roasting meat, the cries of vendors hawking their wares. The traveler and the girl moved through the press of people, seeking nothing more than grain and dried fruit. But when a group of men saw the cloth tied to her satchel, their voices rose above the crowd. "There she is again," one sneered, loud enough for all to hear. "The cursed child. Bought like livestock, raised like a fool's pet." Laughter followed. The girl stiffened, but she did not lower her gaze. Her hand brushed the cloth, steadying herself. Another man stepped forward, emboldened by the crowd. "Tell us, traveler, how much did she cost you? Was it worth the silver, or has she been nothing but a burden?" The crowd roared with cruel delight. Some clapped, some jeered. A woman shook her head in mock pity. Children pointed. The laughter thickened until it pressed like smoke in her lungs. The girl wanted to speak, to shout that she was no one's burden, that her life was her own, but the words stuck in her throat. The sound of ridicule was heavier than any chain. That was when the traveler stepped forward. His voice was low at first, but it carried, silencing some of the laughter. "You think her worthless because she was sold. You think her cursed because she was born in blood. But hear me, she is more free than any of you." The crowd stirred. The jeers faltered, curiosity mingling with unease. He went on, louder now. "You mock me for spending coin. I tell you this. There is no higher use for silver than to break a chain. I did not buy her to own her. I bought her so that no one else could. And in doing so, I bought myself freedom too. Freedom from the shame of standing silent while injustice lived." His words struck like hammer blows. The men who had jeered first scowled, but others in the crowd shifted uneasily, their laughter fading. One man spat on the ground. "Big words. But she is still nothing. Look at her, frail, marked by death, carrying rags like a trophy." Before the traveler could answer, the girl stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "This rag," she said, gripping the cloth at her side, "is proof that I survived what should have ended me. It is proof that your scorn cannot bury me. You call me cursed, then let the curse be. This, that I will live free while you remain slaves to your own cruelty." Her words hung in the air like a blade. The crowd fell into a heavy silence. Some looked away, ashamed. Others frowned, confused. But no one laughed. The traveler placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, pride warming his weary face. "There," he said softly, for her ears alone. "Your voice is stronger than mine." Together, they walked on through the stunned crowd. No one barred their way. The jeers did not resume. Later that night, as they camped beyond the town, the girl sat by the fire with her knees drawn close. She stared at the flames, replaying the moment over and over. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. My voice shook. The traveler shook his head. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is speaking through the shaking." She thought on that long into the night, her hand resting on the cloth. For the first time, she did not see it as a burden she carried into hostile towns. She saw it as a banner, a challenge raised against every chain, every jeer, every cruel custom. Against the crowd, she had not been silenced. She had stood, and that she realized was the beginning of freedom. The story of her beginning was a shadow she could never fully escape. Wherever she traveled, when whispers arose, they always circled back to the same tale. A mother who died in childbirth, a child sold before she could draw a full breath, a stranger who bought her from the block. Some spoke it as mockery, others in hushed awe. To her, it was neither. It was simply the truth, the dark soil from which her life had grown. But as she grew into her youth, that truth began to shape not only her, but those who heard it. One evening, she and the traveler found shelter in a small village tucked between the hills. The people there were weary, their fields thin, their homes patched with more hope than wood. Around the fire in the central square, travelers often told stories. When the girl was urged to share hers, she hesitated. The villagers' eyes were kind but curious. Some children leaned forward eagerly. An old woman, face lined as dry earth, smiled encouragingly. And so, for the first time, the girl told it. Herself, she spoke of how her life had begun in blood, how her mother's last breath had been her first. She told of the auction block, of the jeering crowd, of the traveler who bought her freedom instead of her body. Her voice wavered at times, but she did not stop. When she finished, silence hung heavy. Villagers' faces reflected more than pity, they reflected recognition. One man, thin as his ox, said softly, "We've sold children too, when famine left us no choice. But never have I thought of what became of them." The old woman nodded slowly. "And never did I hear of one who was freed, not owned." The girl looked down, uncertain. "I don't tell it to shame you," she said quickly. "I tell it because I lived. And if I lived, perhaps those children you sold might have lived too. Perhaps their stories are not ended." Her words settled into the firelight, soft but strong. And in that moment, she understood what the traveler had meant when he told her she belonged to herself. Her life was no longer just survival. It was testimony. That night, as they lay under a thatched roof offered by the villagers, the traveler whispered to her, "You have carried your story from womb to world. That is a gift. Use it well." She did not fully grasp his meaning, but in the days ahead, she began to see Dot in another town. When a young mother despaired of feeding her newborn twins, the girl sat beside her and shared how she too had been unwanted, yet had lived. The mother wept, but her tears were no longer of despair. She clutched her children tighter, murmuring, "If she lived, so will you." In yet another village, when a group of boys taunted a crippled child, she knelt beside him and told him how the world had once mocked her as cursed. The boy straightened, his chin trembling but lifted. The boys fell silent. Slowly, her story became something larger than herself. She was no longer only the girl who had been sold, nor even the girl who carried a blood-stained cloth. She was the girl who lived when no one expected her to, the girl whose survival whispered hope into places where hope had long been thin. One evening, as the traveler watched her speak to a circle of children, he felt the weight of years settle on him. He realized she was no longer the fragile bundle he had carried from the auction block. She had carried herself into the world now, her voice shaping others, her stories spreading like seeds cast on the wind. Later, when they walked alone, under the stars, he said, "I was only meant to guard you until you could walk on your own. But now you walk farther than I can." She looked at him, startled. "You speak as though you will leave me." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Not leave, but one day you won't need me. One day your steps will carry you farther than mine ever could." She felt a pang of fear at that thought, but also pride. She was no longer only born of blood and chains. She was born of defiance, of freedom, of a story stronger than death itself. From womb to world, she had been carried first by another's arms, and now by her own. And the world, she realized, was listening. Freedom had never come cheaply. She began to realize this not in a single moment, but slowly in the weight of countless choices the traveler made for her dot. At first, when she was small, she thought little of it. He always gave her the larger share of food, even when his stomach growled louder than hers. He always wrapped his cloak around her shoulders on cold nights, even when frost stiffened his own hands. He always placed himself between her and danger. A wild dog, a drunk in the street, the edge of a blade. But as she grew, she began to notice the cost in his face. The lines carved deeper, the weariness that lingered longer, the way his eyes sometimes looked toward the horizon as if searching for something he had lost along the way. One night, after a long day of walking, she pressed him. "Why do you always give me the better share? Why do you carry more than I do?" He answered simply, "Because you must live, you must grow." She frowned. "But so must you." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "I've already lived much. You are only beginning." The truth sank into her slowly. Her freedom, the chance to breathe, to walk, to speak her own name, had been bought not just with silver that day at the auction, but with the strength of his body, the wear of his years, the sacrifices he made daily without complaint. And it was not only physical. She began to see how the world treated him because of her dot in some towns. Doors that would have opened for a lone traveler closed when they saw the girl with him. People whispered that he carried a cursed child, that he defied sacred custom. Once, a merchant demanded double price, sneering, "Pay for the trouble you bring with you." The traveler paid without flinching. But that night, she heard him cough into his hand and saw the blood on his knuckles in the firelight. "What freedom costs," he murmured, as if to himself, "is often borne by those who grant it." The words clung to her, heavier than any. Chained out, she began to carry more after that. She insisted on gathering wood, fetching water, cleaning the pots. At first, he resisted. "These are not your burdens yet," he said. But she looked him in the eye and answered, "Then let me carry them anyway. If my freedom costs you, let me pay my share." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. From then on, their journey became a partnership, not just a guardianship. Yet she knew she could never repay him fully. His sacrifice was more than labor. It was the constant risk he carried by keeping her close. In villages where custom ruled, he was branded a fool, even a traitor. Men spat at his feet, women muttered curses. He bore it all in silence. One day, after a particularly cruel encounter where a group of men mocked him as the slave of his own slave, she burst into tears when they were alone. "I'm the reason they treat you so badly," she cried. "You suffer because of me." The traveler knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "No," he said firmly. "I suffer because of the world's blindness, because they cannot see worth where it is plain before me. Do not mistake the cost of freedom as your fault. It is simply the price that must be paid, and I pay it gladly." She clung to those words, but they also burned in her. For the first time, she understood that freedom was not light. It was heavy, bought with pain, carried by sacrifice. And yet, she also understood that she could not waste it. To let his suffering be for nothing would be the deepest betrayal. That night, as he slept by the fire, she whispered into the dark, clutching the blood-stained cloth at her side. "I will live fully," she vowed. "I will live fiercely. Because you have given me the chance, I will make the cost worth paying." The flames flickered as though sealing her promise. The day she was born was meant to be the day her life was bound. Sold before she could cry, silenced before she could breathe. Her first moments were meant to prove the customs right, that the weak belonged to chains. But the traveler's hand on that auction block had broken that fate. And now, years later, the ripples of that single act began to spread farther than either of them imagined. They entered a border village at dusk, weary from the road. The people there were hard-eyed, their fields ragged from drought. Near the square, the traveler sought food, but the girl noticed something else. A small crowd gathered around the well, voices sharp with argument. Curious, she edged closer. At the center stood a gaunt woman clutching a boy of perhaps 6 years. He was pale, trembling, with a twisted leg that made standing painful. Beside them, a man, the woman's husband, perhaps argued with the village headman. "We can't keep him," the man said harshly. "He eats but cannot work. Better to sell him and feed the rest." The woman wept, clutching the boy tighter. "He is my son." The headman frowned, torn but bound by the same old custom. "The village survives by sacrifice. You know this." The girl's chest tightened. The words were too familiar, echoing her own beginning. She stepped forward before she had time to think. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't sell him." All eyes turned. Whispers rippled. The stranger, the cursed girl. The headman narrowed his eyes. "And who are you to speak on our custom?" She lifted her chin, her hand gripping the strip of blood-stained cloth at her side. "I am the one who was sold. On the day I was born, they put me on the block. They said I was cursed, worthless. But a man bought me, not to own me, but to free me. And now I stand here, alive, stronger than your fear." The crowd stirred, some scoffing, others uneasy. She went on, voice firm though her heart pounded. "You call it custom, but it is cowardice. You chain your weakest to save yourselves, but you do not see it is in the weakest that strength is proven. You would cast away this child, yet he breathes, he fights, he endures. That is worth more than all your grain." Silence fell. The mother clutched her son closer, tears streaking her face. The father looked away, shame flickering. In his eyes, the headman bristled. Big words from a girl. "What do you know of survival?" The traveler's voice rang out then, low but commanding. "She knows more of survival than anyone here. She was sold before she could walk, and yet she stands." The girl met the headman's gaze. "Sell him, and you will prove nothing but your own cruelty. Let him live, and you may yet prove your humanity." The crowd shifted again. Some murmured agreement. Others avoided her eyes. The weight of her words pressed against the old chain of custom. Straining it at last, the headman exhaled, weary. "Take the boy, then. Let the burden be yours." The mother wept in relief, hugging her son fiercely. The father lowered his head, silent. The crowd dispersed slowly, uneasily, their whispers uncertain, but the boy was not sold. That night, by the fire outside the village, the traveler looked at her long and steady. "Today, you took your first breath of justice." She frowned. "Slightly. I only spoke what was true." He nodded. "Yes, and truth, when spoken against cruelty, becomes justice." She thought on that long after he slept. The boy's face, pale and afraid, stayed with her. So did the mother's tears. She realized that her life was no longer only her own. Her story had given her voice, and her voice now carried weight. The cloth at her side felt heavier than usual. Not a burden, but a banner. Her survival was no longer just survival. It was a challenge to every chain still unbroken, and as the firelight flickered, she whispered to herself, "If my first breath was stolen, then every breath I take now will be for those still bound." The night held its silence, but somewhere in that silence she felt the world listening. She grew into a woman not defined by the blood that stained her beginning, nor by the jeers that followed her childhood, nor even by the man who had lifted her from the auction block. She grew into a woman defined by her own voice. By now, The story of the cursed girl who lived had spread far beyond the markets and villages they had once passed through. Travelers whispered it at roadside fires. Mothers told it to frighten children as proof that despair was never final. Some cursed it as dangerous, claiming it encouraged defiance against sacred customs. Others clung to it as hope. But for her, the story was not myth. It was marrow. One evening, she and the traveler returned to the very marketplace where her life had begun, the same cracked wooden stage, the same air thick with smoke and coin and cruelty. Slaves were still sold there. Children still cried. The same auctioneer, older now, heavier, his beard streaked with gray, still struck the gavel against the block. For a long time she stood in the crowd, silent, the blood-stained cloth tied proudly at her side. She listened as bids were called, as laughter mocked the helpless. She felt the old anger rising, the weight of chains that had bound generations. Then she stepped forward, her voice cut across the din, sharp and unwavering. "Stop." The auctioneer faltered, blinking at her. "What?" She climbed the steps of the platform, her cloak swirling behind her. The crowd murmured, recognizing her, some in awe, others in scorn. "I was sold here once," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. "Sold while my mother's blood was still on me. You laughed. You jeered. You said I was worthless, and yet, here I stand." The crowd shifted uneasily. The auctioneer forced a laugh. "So what? You were bought, weren't you? You belonged to someone." She drew the blood-stained cloth into her hand and held it high. "No, I was freed. He paid silver not for my body, but for my life. And now that life is mine and mine alone." A hush fell. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the faces, the hardened men, the weary women, the children peering wide-eyed from behind their mothers. "You think these chains are unbreakable because they are old. But they are not. Older than mercy. They are not older than justice. And they are not stronger than truth." Her voice rose, fierce and steady. "I am proof that no custom can define a soul. I was not born to be owned. None of us are. Not him, not her, not the smallest child you tried to sell. Our bodies are not your property. Our stories are not your coin." The silence thickened. Some shifted, ashamed. Others clenched their jaws, unwilling to yield. But something had cracked in the air, like stone under frost. The traveler watched from the edge of the crowd, pride heavy in his chest. He saw in her not the fragile infant he had once carried, but a force that could move others to question, to awaken, to change. The auctioneer, his face red with anger, slammed his gavel down. "Enough of this. Words don't change custom." She turned to him, her eyes steady. "Words change people, and people break custom." Then she dropped the blood-stained cloth at the center of the platform, not as refuse, but as a challenge. "This is my beginning. You tried to make it my end, but I chose differently. And now I live to tell it." The crowd erupted, not in laughter this time, but in divided voices. Some shouted for her to be dragged down. Others cried out in agreement, emboldened by her defiance. But it no longer mattered what the crowd thought. What mattered was that her story had been spoken, carved into the place where her chains had nearly been fastened. She stepped down from the block, her head high. The traveler met her at the bottom, his eyes glistening. "You did it," he murmured. She shook her head. "No, I only told the truth. It was always waiting to be heard." He smiled. "And now it will echo." She touched the cloth once more before leaving it behind, no longer needing to carry it. It was not the rag that defined her, nor the blood, nor even the silver once paid for her dot. It was her voice, her defiance, her freedom. She was not her body, not her burden, not her chains. She was her story. And the world at last had heard it.